Now, we know that Israel wants to destroy the Shia Muslim Hezbollah army in the south of Lebanon, but now there has been an airstrike in the mostly Christian north. 21 people have died. The Times' Edmund Bower is in Beirut. Edmund, can you explain to us why this particular area, this particular community was affected, targeted?
Hi, good morning. Yes, it's only just happened, so we're still we only have a few details. What has already been reported is that one of the families who was leasing the building, it was leased to a few families who were displaced from Shiite areas, and supposedly one of the families was a member of Hezbollah. For now, this is all we know, and I think this is the suspicion when the attack was first reported. But it's a worrying development for people who live in a country where certain areas were up until yesterday considered relatively safe, and this is a particularly quiet, rural Christian area in northern Lebanon. So I think it's come as a shock to everyone.
How likely is it that some kind of Hezbollah individual or infrastructure or whatever would be in an area like that? I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, but actually I suppose maybe that is a tactic employed by Hezbollah.
I wouldn't say it would necessarily be a tactic. There have been about 1.2 million people displaced from Shiite areas, so the south of Lebanon, the south of Beirut, which has left other areas with a large influx of people escaping the airstrikes. In amongst them are presumably Hezbollah affiliates, either members or potentially senior members. I think this is a worry for people. There was talk yesterday in northern Lebanon, local authorities reaffirming their desire to give shelter to people escaping airstrikes, but wanting to tighten up on background checks of people who are moving in to decrease the risk of strikes affecting those areas as well.
And how do they carry out background checks?
It's a good question. I mean, the thing is, people who are coming from these areas, Hezbollah is so part of society in South Lebanon and South Beirut and other places. So a lot of people have connections, if not close ties, with the group anyway. How you differentiate them between somebody who might be a target, I think, would be very difficult.
Can you explain geographically, because we hear a lot about the south of Lebanon and the operations that the Israeli army have initiated there, and now today we're hearing about the north of the country. The rest of the country, has that been untouched? Is that considered safe?
No, I think, well, first thing to mention is Lebanon is a very small country. The distance between the south and the north is a kind of an afternoon's car ride. The rest of the country, when we talk about it, there are pockets, some large pockets, which have been affected by Israeli airstrikes. So in the east, the Bekaa Valley has had a fair few strikes, even into yesterday as well. So geographically, these areas are not far from each other. It would be entirely possible to be in an area which is considered safe and be able to hear airstrikes in another area.
I see.
And I think more and more we're using the term relatively safe. If you talk to people now, everyone is convinced that nowhere is completely safe anymore.
The continuing argument, the argument is continuing over the role of the UN in Lebanon. Israel now saying that it found Hezbollah tunnels 100 meters away from UNIFIL posts. So what do we read into that Israel can explain what happened because of the proximity, or are they suggesting that the UN, that UNIFIL turn a blind eye, might have known about the tunnels?
I think it's anybody's guess. You would have to see what Israel believes exactly, and you would have to see what UNIFIL knew exactly. UNIFIL has been there for a long time. And Hezbollah, like I said, is deeply ingrained in the society in the south. So it's not like UNIFIL doesn't know about Hezbollah's presence in the area. They must know. I think their argument now is that they are still trying under fair to them to say very difficult conditions to continue to at least attempt to carry out the mission which they're there to do. In terms of turning a blind eye to Hezbollah, I'm not sure if I would make that assessment, but they're definitely aware of Hezbollah's presence in the area.
Edmund, just finally, we talk a lot about this imminent or upcoming attack by Israel on Iran, and we're talking obviously about what's happening in Lebanon, and it feels like we're talking a lot less about Gaza and what is happening there. What is your up-to-date information about how often there are attacks or airstrikes or whatever is currently happening in Gaza?
Well, the situation in Gaza is ongoing, even though it slipped out of the headlines recently. It's not let up. Northern Gaza is under siege at the moment. The last time I checked, it was 300 people who had died in that siege, and Israeli authorities were talking about turning it into a closed military area, so the people who still haven't left Northern Gaza would be forced to leave, and the situation could become much dire. There's already talk of a humanitarian crisis in the north because of the lack of food and supplies that's been able to get in. And throughout the rest of the country, strikes continue. There were horrific images of a hospital that was bombed this weekend.
Yeah.
People hooked up to IVs who were caught in a fire. So yeah, Gaza, the situation, I'm afraid to say, has not improved, even though we are hearing about it a bit less.
Yes. Edmund, thank you very much for bringing us up to date. That's the Times' Edmund Bower, who is speaking to us from Beirut.
The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has condemned the large number of civilian casualties in northern Gaza as Israel's ground offensive there intensifies. The UN Palestinian Refugee Agency, UNRWA, says 10 people were killed and 40 injured after an Israeli attack on a food distribution centre in the Jabalia refugee camp. And it comes after an Israeli strike on a school in Gaza used as a shelter, which is now reported to have killed 22 people, while in Lebanon, local officials say 21 people died in an Israeli strike in Aitu in the north of the country. Israel, meanwhile, has told the US its response to a Hezbollah drone attack on an army base on Sunday, which killed 4 Israeli soldiers, would be forceful. President Netanyahu has published a video on X defending Israel's actions.
The charge that Israel deliberately attacked UNIFIL personnel is completely false. It's exactly the opposite. Israel repeatedly asked UNIFIL to get out of harm's way. It repeatedly asked them to temporarily leave the combat zone, which is right next to Israel's border with Lebanon. In fact, on the day that Israel began its ground operation next to our border with Lebanon, we asked them specifically, please leave this area so you're not harmed.
Well, that was the latest video from Benjamin Netanyahu. Gerald Fierstein is director at the Washington Middle East Institute. He's a former US Consul General in Jerusalem and a former US ambassador to Yemen. Good evening to you, Gerald.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Carol.
Really good to have you with us. Let me pick up, first of all, on those comments from Benjamin Netanyahu, who is referring to the recent attacks that have landed on UN posts in southern Lebanon. Do you accept, what he's saying there, that Israel has been trying to avoid attacking and hitting at UN positions?
Well, of course, the irony is that UNIFIL is in those positions specifically because it's on the border between Israel and Lebanon, and that is their mission, which is to separate the parties so that they don't get into conflict. So, on the one hand, UNIFIL is doing its job by being on the border, and to have the Israelis say, "Well, we're trying to protect you by telling you not to do your job and to leave this area." Is a bit ironic, and so So as long as the UN believes that the UNIFIL mission is important, then those personnel are going to need to say where they are.
And let's just turn our attention to what's happening in northern Gaza, because it does seem as though Israel's offensive there has intensified. We've now had more deaths in the Jabalia refugee camp. Israel again says that it told people to leave, but frankly, those that are still in this part of Gaza are saying that, I mean, they've got nowhere to go to.
Right. This is the situation, and unfortunately, as the Israelis continue to put out these warnings to people to leave, the area that they have established as a safe zone gets smaller and smaller. And we've also seen that even within these safe zones that they've established that they say that they're not going to attack, people are still being killed by Israeli attacks. So they really are leaving people with no alternative, no place else to go. And then the question is, what exactly is their strategy? What is their intent here? It goes back to the earlier question of whether they're actually trying to depopulate Gaza.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, do you think that this could be part of this strategy floated by some former Israeli generals calling for northern Gaza to be completely cleared of civilians and for the remaining militants to be put under a siege until they surrender? Now, senior Israeli officials are saying that this is not their policy, this is not what they're doing. But it does begin to look like that, doesn't it?
Well, this is absolutely the concern, and this has been going on now for many months, where they tell people to move to one place, and then as soon as they move to one place, they tell them to move to another place. And I think that the populations are becoming exhausted. They're frustrated. There's insufficient food, medicine, any other kind of service available to them, and so. Yes, I think the question is, and it's not only former Israeli military officials, it's also serving ministers of the Netanyahu government who've alluded to this as an objective over the course of this campaign.
I mean, is that a strategy that can possibly work?
Well, no, it won't work, and of course it runs counter not only to Israel's obligations under international law, but to UN Security Council resolutions and to the clear demands of the international community, that Israel must do better to protect the innocent civilian population in Gaza. So it's not a strategy that can be implemented, but in the meantime, of course, it's incurring dozens or hundreds or even thousands of casualties among the Palestinians there.
Let me put to you a point that one of our listeners has made. Stefan's got in touch to say that UNIFIL, which is the peacekeeping force in southern Lebanon, has been watching Hezbollah build up its weapons store and build tunnels for 20 years without any action. They've also been watching Hezbollah fire thousands of rockets at Israel over the last year. What are they actually doing as peacekeepers? And of course, we did see that missile attack in which 4 Israelis were killed in northern Israel recently. I mean, what do you make of that point that Stefan is making there, that they haven't done enough to curb the activities of Hezbollah?
Well, there's a limitation on how much UNIFIL can accomplish. They are not really in a position either to prevent Hezbollah or the Israelis, who have been equally violating of UN Security Council resolutions and other requirements. So, they can do what they can. They report. They try to monitor. They can bring their evidence to the UN Security Council, but then it's up to the Security Council to act and to demand that the two parties move forward. There's been a long effort on the part of the U.S. and others in the international community to implement the Security Council Resolution 1701, that was agreed to in 2006 that would provide greater buffer between the competing forces between Hezbollah and the Israelis. But so far that hasn't been successful. But these things are more political than they are military, and you can't expect UNIFIL really to fill that role without strong political support and backing.
And Israel is now stepping up its offensive in northern Gaza. It is also engaged in these attacks into southern Israel. And we've had this strike on northern Israel, on Aitu. I mean, is this just about Israel going after what it says is Hezbollah targets in Lebanon? Because it does certainly seem to have, and we saw that strike in the centre of Beirut the other day. Is that just all part of this same strategy? Because it does certainly seem to be fighting on several different fronts.
Yes, the pace of the campaigns in both Gaza and South Lebanon are picking up. Big question of what exactly are Israeli objectives in Lebanon. They had originally said that their goal was simply to drive Hezbollah again north of the Litani River, as was laid out in the 1701 Security Council resolution. That would provide that buffer zone. Now the question is whether that is really as far as the Israelis intend to go, or are they going to go farther? Are they going to cross the Litani and actually enter Beirut's southern suburbs? And we've also seen, of course, the pace of Hezbollah resistance picking up. So a number of casualties, not only the one you mentioned against the Golani Brigade, but also, of course, in ground fighting inside of Lebanon. So the destruction, the concern about expanding conflict, and where is Iran in all of this, and does Iran get drawn farther into the conflict? All of these questions are out there, very concerning to everybody who's trying to limit the scope of these fires that are burning.
Gerald Fierstein, director at the Washington Middle East Institute, former Deputy US Consul General in Jerusalem, and a former US ambassador to Yemen. Really good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us.